Number 10. The Happy Delivery, Captain George Lowther. There's never been a more ironically named ship in the history of piracy. She began her life as the Gambia Castle, a slave ship owned by the Royal African Company patrolling the Fever Coast of West Africa in 1721, and her second mate was a bitter, ambitious Englishman named George Lowther. Lowther had watched his captain die of fever, watched a soldier named John Massey clash with the merchants ashore, watched discipline unravel under the West African sun, and one night while the ship's officers were on land, he and Massey called a vote among the crew. The men voted to sail, they voted to take the guns, take the ship, and take the account. Lowther renamed her the Delivery and steered west across the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. When Massey and his soldiers wanted to sack a French village, the vote went against them. Massey and his men were put ashore in a captured sloop, and Lowther took a smaller, faster vessel, mounted her with 8 guns and 10 swivels, and christened her the Happy Delivery. That was where the irony began, because nothing about what happened on her decks was happy, and nothing about her arrival on the horizon meant deliverance for anyone. Lowther and his men developed a signature. They would not haul alongside a target the way most pirates did. They would ram. The Happy Delivery would come thundering out of a squall or a dawn haze at full canvas, drive her bowsprit into the enemy's rigging, and the pirates would swarm across before the merchant crew even understood what had struck them. Once aboard, Lowther's men did what Lowther's men did. They beat the crew, they flogged the captain, they set some of the ships on fire while the survivors watched from the pirate deck, waiting to be told whether they lived or died. In January 1722, in the Bay of Honduras, the Happy Delivery ran down a Boston merchantman called the Greyhound under Captain Benjamin Edwards, and the account that survives is savage. When the resistance was over, the Greyhound's crew was beaten, several killed, and the ship set alight. That was the moment the reputation set. Every log woodcutter in the bay, every trader between the Windward Passage and the Mosquito Coast learned the shape of that hull and the name painted on her stern. Because, riding as Lowther's lieutenant aboard the Happy Delivery was a small poisonous man named Edward Lowe, who was already experimenting with the tortures that would soon make him the most feared pirate in the Western Hemisphere. Merchant captains who spotted the Happy Delivery on the horizon and recognized her did not run. They lowered their flags, opened their holds, and prayed. Because if you fought her and lost, you did not lose your cargo. You lost your ears. You lost your nose. You lost your ship in a bonfire on the open sea. The mathematics of surrender was simple. The Happy Delivery herself met her end, not in battle, but on a beach. Sometime in 1722, careening on a lonely shore, she was attacked by the local Kalinago population and destroyed. Lowther transferred to a smaller sloop called the Ranger and kept killing for another year until he was cornered on the island of Blenquilla by a company sloop called the Eagle. He escaped in the confusion, made it to the beach, and there, according to the pursuers, he was found dead with a pistol in his hand, having preferred a self-inflicted end to the noose. The Happy Delivery was gone, but for 18 months, her name had done work no cannon could. She had emptied decks from Honduras to the Carolinas with nothing but the sound of her hull cutting water. Number 9. The Rising Sun, Captain William Moody. On a hot morning off the coast of Sierra Leone in 1719, a British slaving captain named William Snellgrave sat in his cabin and made peace with dying. The ship coming down on him was black. Not painted black, hulled in black. Her canvas was patched red where the sailmakers had run out of white cloth, and her flag was the strangest thing Snellgrave had ever seen. It showed a white man pierced through with 3 arrows, standing over a red heart, bleeding red drops onto the black field of the flag. The captain of that ship called himself William Moody, and the ship was called the Rising Sun. She had been a merchantman named the Resolution before Moody's crew took her, and once he had her, he armed her with 36 guns and 130 men, white and black, drawn from every port and jail the Caribbean could empty into a longboat. In the summer of 1718, off the island of St. Christopher Moody, sailed the Rising Sun as flagship of a small squadron taking merchant vessels, one after another, and treating them differently depending on his mood. Some he plundered and let go. Some he burned to the waterline, some he stranded on reefs, so their crews could watch the tide pull the ships apart. The reports flooded into the governor's office at Antigua so fast that Governor Hamilton begged London for a warship because his own ships could not touch her. The Rising Sun could outshoot anything below a fourth-rate frigate, and she could outrun anything that could shoot her. Merchant captains in the Leeward Islands learned to read the horizon the way farmers read the sky. And when the black hull and red-patched sails came over the rim of the world, they struck. They struck because they had heard what the Rising Sun did to men who did not. By the spring of 1719, Moody had crossed the Atlantic and was cruising the Guinea coast of Africa. And here is where the story turns into something out of tragedy. Moody had begun his career among mutineers, and he ended it among mutineers. Somewhere off Cape Verde, a portion of his crew, led by a hard man named Thomas Coughlin, decided Moody's mercy toward one captured captain had been an insult. Moody defeated the mutiny, marooned Coughlin and 25 of his men, and thought the business was finished. It was not. The rest of the crew, angry that Moody had denied Coughlin a share of the plunder, turned on him within weeks. In April 1719, they forced Moody and 12 of his supporters into a small, open boat and cast them off into the ocean. The captain, who had made 130 men rich and 100 merchant captains bankrupt, disappeared into the Atlantic in a boat with no chart and no water. He was never seen again. But the Rising Sun sailed on. She was taken over by Olivier Levasseur, better remembered as Le Buse, the buzzard who would go on to become one of the most feared pirates the Indian Ocean ever saw, and she carried his flag from the Guinea coast to Madagascar. That is the strange, awful legacy of the Rising Sun. Her captain was so feared that his own crew marooned him out of fear, and yet her reputation outlived his command because the men who came after him inherited a ship whose name alone had already done half their work. Number 8, the Chasseur, Captain Thomas Boyle. She was not a pirate ship in the technical sense. She sailed under a letter of marque from the government of the United States during the War of 1812, which made her a privateer, which is the polite word for a pirate carrying a piece of paper. But every British merchant captain who watched her lay a warning shot across his bows in the summer of 1814 called her exactly what she was: a raider, a hunter, a ship that arrived off your quarter with the wind and left with everything you owned. She was 115 feet long from stem to stern, a Baltimore clipper schooner built by Thomas Kemp at Fells Point in December 1812, and she was probably the fastest sailing vessel her tonnage class had ever produced. She carried 16 guns. Her captain was a 37-year-old Irish-American named Thomas Boyle, who had first gone to sea at 10 years old and had already taken 9 prizes in a previous ship called the Comet. When Boyle took command of the Chasseur in the summer of 1814, he sailed her east across the Atlantic, straight into the heart of the British Empire, and what he did next has no equal in maritime history. Boyle sailed the Chasseur into the English Channel, into the Irish Sea. He began taking British merchantmen inside sight of British lighthouses, sometimes 2 in a day, and when he ran short of prize crews to sail them back to America, he sank them. In August, he captured a British merchant vessel called the Marquis of Cornwallis, and did something no one in the history of naval warfare had ever attempted. He wrote out a proclamation on a piece of paper on the deck of his ship, and he ordered the captain of the Marquis of Cornwallis to carry it into London and post it on the door of Lloyd's coffee house, the beating heart of the British insurance industry. The proclamation declared that Thomas Boyle, commanding the private armed brig Chasseur, hereby placed the entire United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland under a state of strict and rigorous blockade. All ports, all harbors, all bays, all creeks, all rivers, all inlets, all outlets, all islands, all seacoasts, with one ship against the largest navy on earth. It should have been laughed at. It was not. Because within days of the proclamation being posted at Lloyd's insurance rates on British shipping in home waters climbed to numbers no underwriter had seen in the war. The Admiralty, humiliated, was forced to pull 17 warships off other duties, including 14 sloops and 3 frigates, and station them along the western coasts of England to hunt 1 American schooner. Boyle captured 18 vessels on that cruise. He evaded every warship sent after him. He returned to Baltimore in the spring of 1815. And the papers called the Chasseur the Pride of Baltimore, a name the city has never let go of. British captains on the home coast, in the autumn of 1814, had begun striking their colors the moment they identified her, because they knew resistance was pointless. She had been designed for exactly this work by the finest shipwright in America, and she was captained by a man who did not know how to lose. Boyle died aboard his ship in 1825, still at sea, still moving. And to this day, the city of Baltimore keeps a modern replica sailing under her name. Number 7. The terrible Captain William Death. If you had asked a British newspaper reader in the winter of 1757 to name the single most cursed ship afloat, they would not have hesitated. She was called the Terrible. She was a privateer of 300 tons sailing under a letter of marque out of London during the opening months of the 7 Years' War, and her muster book, as the newspapers told it, read like a document from a nightmare. Her captain was named Death, William Death. His brother John Death served aboard as her 4th lieutenant. Her master surgeon was reportedly named Ghost. Her first lieutenant, as the story went, was named Devil. Death, Devil, and Ghost, sailing together on the Terrible. Contemporary press accounts printed the muster with something like delight, because it read like fiction, and because at the time, nobody had yet met her fate. The advertisement for her crew appeared in London's Daily Advertiser in the autumn of 1756, and one of the young men who read it and answered the call was a broke staymaker named Thomas Paine, who would 20 years later write the pamphlet Common Sense and help start the American Revolution. Paine's father talked him out of sailing on that particular voyage. It saved his life. The Terrible sailed from London in November 1756, mounted with 26 carriage guns and manned with 200 sailors. On the 23rd of December, she engaged a large French vessel called the Alexander Le Grand off the Bay of Biscay, and after a running battle, she took her as a prize. But the price was steep. Lieutenant John Death, the captain's brother, was killed. 16 other men were killed. 40 more were sent aboard the French prize as a prize crew, which meant the Terrible sailed on with a hollowed-out compliment toward Plymouth. On the 27th of December, in the mouth of the English Channel, another sail appeared on the horizon flying English colors. It was a lie. The ship was a French privateer out of St. Malo, a 36-gun killer called the Vengeance, carrying 360 men. She ran up her real colors only when she was in point-blank range, and she slid between the Terrible and the recaptured Alexandre Le Grande, and then she opened fire from both broadsides. The first French broadside took away the Terrible's mainmast. The battle that followed lasted for hours, and there was no quarter given by either side. When the smoke cleared, 2/3 of the Vengeance's crew were dead, including her captain and second-in-command. But aboard the Terrible, of the 200 men who had left London 6 weeks earlier, only 26 were still alive. Captain William Death was not among them. He had gone down fighting on his own quarterdeck. The name of the ship, the name of the captain, the muster book of Death and Devil and Ghost, the running battle that killed nearly everyone aboard, all of it hit the London papers within weeks and became a sensation. A 22-verse ballad was composed by prisoners of the surviving crew in a French jail. The Terrible had done exactly what her name promised. She had killed the enemy, and she had killed her own captain, and she had made her small piece of the sea into a name no sailor in home waters ever wanted to hear again. Number 6. The Mocha, Captain Robert Culliford. In the year 1698, the wealthiest company in the world was the English East India Company. Its ships carried spices, cotton, silks, saltpeter, silver, and porcelain across the Indian Ocean and down the Red Sea, and the company's officers walked the docks at Bombay and Surat with the confidence of men whose flag was the flag of an empire. But there was one ship out there in the Indian Ocean that the company could not stop and could not catch. She had been the company's own vessel. She had once been called the Mocha frigate, 350 tons, 36 guns, built for the company and captained by a man named Leonard Edgecombe. In 1695, sailing out of Bombay, her crew had risen in mutiny under a man called Ralph Stout, murdered Edgecombe, and turned pirate. They renamed her the Defense, though everyone in the Indian Ocean still called her the Mocha. Stout took her east into the Bay of Bengal and hunted the very lanes the company had built her to protect. It was already a scandal. And then in 1697, it got worse. In the summer of 1697, Ralph Stout was killed on a shore party at Sumatra, and the crew of the Mocha elected a new captain, a small, hard-eyed Cornishman named Robert Culliford. Culliford was already a legend in the pirate ports of Madagascar. He had sailed with William Kidd in the Blessed William. He had spent 4 years rotting in an Indian prison at Junagadh. He had escaped, hijacked an East India Company ketch called the Josiah, been marooned by loyalist crewmen on a Nicobar island, been rescued at random by Ralph Stout's Mocha, and now he was captain of the ship the company most wanted destroyed. What followed was 3 years of humiliation for the company. Culliford took the Mocha off Malabar, off the mouth of the Red Sea, off Madagascar, and the company's convoys learned to scatter when her topsails appeared on the horizon. In 1697, he attempted to attack the East Indiaman Doral and only broke off when a lucky cannonball took away his mainmast. In 1698, off the island of Inonjuan, Culliford met a Rhode Island pirate named Richard Chivers with 90 men and 12 guns, and the two crews formed a partnership. Off Surat, they took a Turkish ship of the Mocha fleet carrying over 120,000 pounds sterling in gold coin, one of the largest hauls ever taken by a pirate in the Indian Ocean. The Mocha's own share was so vast that Culliford's men each walked away with between 700 and 800 pounds, a sum that would have kept the working sailor in Bristol comfortable for the rest of his life. But the truest measure of the Mocha's terror was not the treasure. It was what happened aboard the ship called the Great Muhammad, which she took near the Red Sea. It was that no company convoy in the Arabian Sea sailed without a pit of dread in the stomach. It was that, when Culliford himself arrived at the pirate haven of St. Marie in Madagascar, he found William Kidd himself waiting there with the adventure galley, plotting revenge against Culliford for the mutiny of years before. And Kidd's own crew, hearing what Culliford was, deserted Kidd and joined the Mocha instead. That is the mark of a feared ship. When a captain hunting you loses his crew to your reputation before the first shot is fired, the Mocha's end was quiet. Culliford eventually took a royal pardon at St. Marie and returned to England, where he testified against his former shipmates and vanished into private life. The ship, by then also called the Resolution, was scuttled in the Red Sea around September 1698. But for 3 years, the sight of her topsails on the horizon meant the company's convoys broke and ran, and the company kept building bigger ships and hiring bigger crews, and it did not matter because none of them could bring themselves to close the range with her. Number 5. The Speaker, Captain John Bowen. She was born in the shipyards of France, a war frigate of 500 tons, 142 feet long, armed with 40 guns and built for the wars of Louis XIV. Her French name has been lost to history because the first man to steal her did not care to record it. That man was an English captain named Eastlake, who took her as a prize, refitted her, and put her into the Atlantic slave trade under the name Speaker. In April 1699, off the west coast of Madagascar in the River Methelage, the Speaker was captured a second time by a pirate crew under an English captain named George Booth, with an ambitious quartermaster among his officers named John Bowen. Booth mounted her with a full 50 guns and made her his flagship, and for a year, the Speaker was one of the most heavily armed ships in the entire Indian Ocean. A floating fortress in an age when merchant vessels commonly carried 12. Then, in 1700, Booth was killed by Arab traders at Zanzibar while trying to negotiate for supplies. The crew of the Speaker elected John Bowen captain. Bowen was born around 1660 in Bermuda, and he was one of the coldest, most calculating pirates of the Indian Ocean generation. He did not torture. He did not need to. He commanded a 50-gun French war frigate. And when the Speaker came out of the haze off Malabar, or Surat, or the coast of Yemen, merchant captains looked at her broadside, counted her ports, and made the only sensible calculation. They struck. In 1701, Bowen ran down a fleet of 13 Moorish vessels off the coast of India. Most escaped in the dark, but the Speaker captured one whose cargo was valued at 100,000 pounds sterling. And Bowen sold shares of the plunder to local Indian merchants at the port of Calicut so openly that the East India Company factors in the town had no power to stop him. Later that year, off the Malabar coast, Bowen attacked and captured an English East Indiaman under a Captain Conway. He towed the prize into port and sold it in 3 shares to local buyers. The Speaker was operating with the confidence of a warship in her own waters. And by then, merchant crews from Persia to the Cape of Good Hope had begun surrendering the moment they identified her. Nothing they carried could survive her broadside, and Bowen had built a reputation for accepting surrender without bloodshed as long as the surrender came fast. Her end was almost comic. On the night of the 7th of January 1702, homeward bound toward Madagascar, the Speaker was underway through the reef fields off Mauritius when her lookouts, reportedly drunk, missed the surf on St. Thomas's Reef. She struck. The 500-ton war frigate ground up on the coral, holed, and could not be got off. Bowen and most of the crew waded ashore on the east coast of Mauritius, then a Dutch possession, and spent 3 months on the beach before purchasing a small sloop and turning her into a brigantine they named the Content. Bowen sailed the Content back to Madagascar, founded a pirate haven at Fort Meriton, and continued his career until 1704. He died of unknown causes at Bourbon shortly afterward. The Speaker herself sat on St. Thomas's Reef for 277 years until, in 1979, a team of French and Mauritian archaeologists located her wreck about 2.5 kilometers off Pointe-aux-Feuilles. What they found on the reef were her cannon, her anchors, her rigging, and the scattered pieces of a ship whose name had once been enough to make experienced captains of the Indian Ocean lower their colors without firing a gun. Number 4. The Fiery Dragon, Captain Christopher Condent. In the year 1720, at the entrance to Bombay Harbor, an Arab merchant vessel of extraordinary size loomed out of the morning mist. She was carrying gold, silver, jewels, silks, and coin. Her captain and crew were experienced hands who had made the run between the Ottoman ports in India many times before. And when they saw the black-hulled ship coming down on them under a black flag showing 3 skulls, they did not fight. They surrendered. The ship coming down on them was called the Fiery Dragon. Her captain was an Englishman named Christopher Condent, born in Plymouth in the 1690s, and he had become one of the most feared pirates of the Indian Ocean, without ever holding the kind of legend that Blackbeard or Roberts held in the Caribbean. He had begun his career in the Bahamas aboard a 12-gun sloop in the pirate haven of New Providence. When Woodes Rogers arrived in 1718 to deliver the king's pardon and end the pirate republic, Condent was one of those who refused to accept and fled. In the Atlantic crossing, an Indian sailor aboard who had been beaten so badly by the other crewmen that he snapped threatened to blow up the powder magazine. Condent leapt into the hold and shot him in the face. According to the accounts that survived, the crew hacked the body apart, and the gunner tore out the heart and boiled it and ate it. That was the atmosphere aboard the ship that would become the Fiery Dragon. Off the Cape Verde Islands, Condent captured a Portuguese wine ship, a squadron of small Portuguese vessels, and finally a Dutch warship that he took for himself and renamed. Some contemporary accounts called her the Flying Dragon. The majority, and the name that stuck in the eyewitness statements, was the Fiery Dragon. He mounted her heavily. He crossed to Brazil and cut off the ears and noses of Portuguese prisoners. He crossed back to West Africa and took the English galley Right, the Indian Queen, a ship called the Fame, and another Dutch vessel. By April 1719, he had reached the pirate haven of Sainte Marie in Madagascar. There he integrated the surviving crew of another pirate named John Halsey into his own. For over a year, he cruised the Indian coast and the Red Sea, taking small prizes, and then in October 1720, off Bombay came the moment that made the Fiery Dragon a legend. The Arab ship he captured that day carried treasure worth 150,000 pounds sterling in precious metals alone, one of the richest single hauls in the entire history of piracy. Condent, understanding that the East India Company would tear the world apart to find him if he mistreated the passengers, gave orders that no captive was to be harmed. The plunder was divided at St. Marie into shares of roughly 2,000 pounds per man, an amount that would have made every one of them wealthier than most colonial governors. And here's the strangest ending in this list. Condent did not die at the end of a rope. He did not disappear into the sea in an open boat. He sailed 40 of his men to the French island of Bourbon, negotiated a full French pardon with the governor, and then married the governor's sister-in-law. He then traveled to France, settled in the port of St. Malo, and became a wealthy merchant. The Fiery Dragon, by contrast, was reportedly scuttled off Sainte Marie around 1721. In more recent decades, the underwater archaeologist Barry Clifford claimed to have located her wreck, though a subsequent UNESCO analysis concluded that the ship he had found was of Asian origin and unrelated. The location of the Fiery Dragon's bones remains a mystery of the Indian Ocean. But for 2 years, her black hull and her flag of 3 skulls emptied decks from the Arabian Sea to the Malabar coast, and merchant captains who lived through the encounter counted themselves lucky. Number 3. The Amity, Captain Thomas II. She was 70 tons. That is the entire story of her audacity in a single number. 70 tons. She carried 8 cannons and 46 men. She was a Rhode Island sloop, single-masted, low-sided, cheap to build, the sort of vessel a fisherman might use in the coastal trade between Bermuda and the American colonies. She was in every measurable respect harmless, and she was the ship that opened the greatest gold rush in the history of piracy. Her captain was named Thomas II, described by those who saw him as slight, dark about 40, given to elegant blue jackets trimmed with gold lace, and to wearing a jewel-handled dagger at his belt. In 1692, II obtained a letter of marque from the Lieutenant Governor of Bermuda, Isaac Richier, and a group of wealthy Bermudian backers financed him with the Amity for a mission to attack a French factory on the west coast of Africa. In December 1692, II set sail with another privateer, George Dew, aboard the sloop Amity. Somewhere off the African coast, a storm separated the 2 vessels, and II called his crew on deck. He told them, in words that have become one of the most famous speeches in pirate history, that he saw no profit in the venture they had been paid for, and that he preferred to risk his life for something worth having. He asked whether they would follow him. According to the account that survived, his crew answered him with a single shout, "A gold chain or a wooden leg, we will stand with you." That was the moment the Amity turned pirate. II set course east, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the east coast of Africa, and into the Red Sea. He was pioneering what would become known as the Pirate Round, the long clockwise route from the American colonies to the Indian Ocean and back. And in the autumn of 1693, at the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, the Amity came up on a great Mughal Ganja dhow, sailing from India to the Ottoman ports. The dhow carried a garrison of 300 soldiers. The Amity had 46 men. It should have been suicide. It was not. For reasons that were never fully explained by any of the survivors, the dhow surrendered with almost no resistance. Perhaps it was the psychological shock of a European raider so far from any Christian port. Perhaps it was the sudden appearance in the dawn haze. Perhaps the Ganja's captain simply decided that his passengers' lives were worth more than a fight. What the Amity's crew found aboard was 100,000 pounds sterling in gold and silver, along with ivory, spices, gemstones, and silk. Each of the Amity's 46 crewmen received a share of between 1,200 and 3,000 pounds. II himself took roughly 8,000 pounds. His Bermudian investors. When the sloop returned to Newport in April 1694, received 14 times the value of their investment. Not 14%. 14 times. Every fisherman in Newport, every longshoreman in Boston, every out-of-work sailor in New York heard the story. II had proved that a 70-ton sloop with 46 men could sail across the world and come back rich enough to buy a colony. Within 18 months, dozens of American captains were fitting out their own vessels for the pirate round. The Indian Ocean gold rush had begun. II himself, unable to resist the call of the sea, purchased a new commission from the notoriously corrupt governor of New York, Benjamin Fletcher, for 300 pounds, and sailed the Amity out on a second cruise in November 1694. That cruise did not end well for him, but the point had already been made. The Amity had rewritten the economics of piracy. She had proved that a small, cheap, harmless-looking ship could return richer than a treasure galleon, and every merchant captain in the Red Sea who spotted a Rhode Island sloop coming out of the sun after 1694 knew what he was looking at, and knew that the sloop's crew had done it once and were willing to do it again and again and again. Number 2, the Golden Fleece, Captain Joseph Bannister. Once upon a time, Joseph Bannister was one of the most respectable merchant captains in the Caribbean. He owned property in Port Royal, Jamaica. He commanded the Golden Fleece, a large merchant vessel armed with 30 to 40 guns, and he sailed the profitable route between England and Jamaica on company work. And then, in the summer of 1684, without warning, he stole his own ship. He simply took the Golden Fleece, took a crew of over 100 men, and sailed her out of Port Royal Harbor as a pirate. The Royal Navy caught him, brought him back for trial, and here the story becomes remarkable. Bannister was acquitted, The court, on some technical ground, let him walk free on the condition he remain in Port Royal under supervision. He did not remain. He escaped. He got aboard the Golden Fleece again, and he sailed her out of the harbor a second time right past the batteries of the most heavily fortified British port in the Western Hemisphere. That was the moment Joseph Bannister crossed a line no colonial governor could ignore. Lieutenant Governor Hender Molesworth of Jamaica sent word to the Admiralty and to the Royal Navy Squadron at Jamaica that the man had to be destroyed. In the spring of 1686, a British sloop spotted Bannister careening the Golden Fleece in Samana Bay on the northeastern coast of Hispaniola, in what is now the Dominican Republic. Careening meant beaching the ship on her side to scrape the hull of barnacles and worm. It was the most vulnerable a wooden ship could ever be. She could not sail, she could not fire her guns from her decks, and Bannister had one small prize vessel with him, nothing else. On the 4th of July, 1686, 2 Royal Navy frigates arrived at Samana Bay to finish the business. Captain Charles Talbot commanded HMS Falcon. Captain Thomas Spragge commanded HMS Drake. Between them, they mounted 56 guns and carried a full complement of trained naval gunners and Marines. They should have destroyed the Golden Fleece in a morning. Bannister had done something no pirate had ever done before. He had unloaded some of the Golden Fleece's cannon and set them up as shore batteries on 2 island vantage points overlooking the anchorage. When the Falcon and the Drake came in, they were fired on from 3 directions at once, from Bannister's careened ship, from one shore battery, and from the other. The battle began at 3 in the afternoon and ran through the night and into the evening of the following day. The Duke suffered 13 casualties. The Falcon suffered 10. And after 2 days of bombardment, the frigates had emptied their magazines. Spragge later reported that he had 1 round left. Talbot had 8 or 9. The 2 Royal Navy frigates, out of ammunition, humiliated, turned and sailed back to Port Royal. It was the first time in the history of Caribbean piracy that any pirate had fought a Royal Navy squadron to a standstill. The Golden Fleece had defeated the Royal Navy. When the frigates returned to Samana Bay a few weeks later after resupply, they found only the burned hulk of the Golden Fleece. Bannister had scuttled her to prevent recapture and escaped in the small prize sloop. It did not save him for long. The Drake caught up with him in January 1687 on the Mosquito Coast, where he was living among the Mosquito people, and Molesworth, taking no chances, ordered him hanged from the Drake's yardarm without trial before he could set foot back in Jamaica. Bannister and 3 of his officers were left dangling from the yardarms as the Drake sailed back into Port Royal Harbor. It was a message. The Golden Fleece rested at the bottom of Samana Bay for over 3 centuries. In 2008, a team including the veteran treasure hunter Tracy Bowden began working with local divers to locate her, and today her wreck site has been extensively studied. Cannon have been recovered. The story has been told again in the archaeological journals. But in 1686, for those 2 days in July in a bay on the northern coast of Hispaniola, the Golden Fleece did something no pirate ship before her had ever done. She held her ground against a Royal Navy squadron. She fired her last round. She sent the frigates home, and every pirate in the Caribbean, and every merchant captain, and every colonial governor heard the story and knew what a determined captain with a small ship and a set of shore batteries could do to the pride of the British Empire. Number 1. The Bachelor's Delight, Captain Edward Davis. In the summer of 1683, a Danish slave ship lay at anchor off the coast of Sierra Leone, waiting to complete her voyage. Aboard her, 36 cannon, a full crew, and a hold designed for the trade in human beings. It was the kind of ship a small buccaneer would look at once and sail away from, but she never got the chance. A privateering captain named John Cook, working with a quartermaster named Edward Davis, and a small crew of English adventurers boarded her by surprise and took her without a fight. The Danes considered it an act of naked piracy against a friendly nation, and it was. Cook did not care. He renamed the ship the Bachelor's Delight, transferred his crew aboard, and turned her bow south. His plan was audacious beyond anything the Caribbean buccaneers had ever attempted. He was going to sail the Bachelor's Delight around Cape Horn and into the Pacific, into the Spanish Sea, into the ocean the Spanish crown believed it owned. In November 1683, the Bachelor's Delight rounded the Horn and entered the Pacific. In March 1684, she met a second buccaneer ship, the Nicholas, under Captain John Eaton, off the coast of Valdivia. Together, the two vessels headed north up the coast of Spanish America. They put in at the Juan Fernandez Islands, where they picked up a Mosquito Indian named Will, who had been marooned there for 3 years by Captain Bartholomew Sharp. They pressed on to the Galapagos, and then in July 1684, Captain Cook fell ill and died at Cape Blanco. The crew of the Bachelor's Delight elected a new captain, Edward Davis. Under Davis, for the next 4 years, the Bachelor's Delight became the single most feared vessel on the Pacific coast of South America. She raided Paita in Peru. She struck at Guayaquil in Ecuador. She descended on León in Nicaragua. She met Captain Charles Swan and the Signet, along with French buccaneers, off Panama, and led a fleet of 10 ships and 500 men in an attempt to intercept the Peruvian silver treasure convoy. She sacked the city of Zania in Peru and took 25,000 pounds sterling in jewels and silver. She took the city of Arica in Chile and took 10,000 pounds more. She burned Pisco. She terrorized Guayaquil twice. She defeated a Spanish naval squadron at Guayaquil in May 1687 alongside the French buccaneer Pierre Le Picard and split 50,000 pounds with him. The Spanish response was drastic. Rather than risk the treasure convoys at sea, while Davis was afloat, the Viceroy of Peru began sending the Potosi silver overland by mule train through the mountains and across the isthmus, an enormously expensive and slow alternative because the sea was no longer safe as long as the Bachelor's Delight was on it. But the strangest thing about the Bachelor's Delight, the reason she stands at the top of this list, is not her plunder, it is who was serving aboard her. The navigator was Ambrose Cowley, who would later write one of the earliest published accounts of the Galapagos Islands and give many of the islands the English names they still carry. The master's mate, or a similar rank, was a Somerset-born sailor named William Dampier, who would later write A New Voyage Round the World. Published in 1697, a book that made him famous across Europe, influenced Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and was carried aboard HMS Beagle by Charles Darwin over 130 years later as he sailed to the same Galapagos Islands Cowley had named. The surgeon and later crewmate connected to the expedition was Lionel Wafer, a Welshman, who wrote A New Voyage and Description of the Isthmus of America, a bestseller of its own that shaped English understanding of Central America for a century. 3 future best-selling authors, on the deck of one pirate ship taking notes, in secret, while the rest of the crew burned Spanish towns. It is one of the most extraordinary intellectual pedigrees any ship has ever carried. Davis eventually left the Pacific in 1688, sailed the Bachelor's Delight back around the Horn, and arrived in the West Indies. He is credited by some accounts with sighting a land somewhere in the Pacific that later cartographers called Davis Land, and that some historians have speculated may have been Easter Island. He took the king's pardon and vanished. Into private life, some sources place him later in Philadelphia. The Bachelor's Delight herself disappeared from the record after Davis left her. But for those 4 years, between 1684 and 1688, a stolen Danish slave ship crewed by English buccaneers, and 3 unknown authors held the entire western coast of Spanish America hostage. And the Spanish, who had built cities of stone and cathedrals of gold and treasure, fleets that had never before been beaten, chose to move their silver by mule rather than by ship because they knew what waited on the horizon. There you have it. 10 pirate ships whose reputations preceded them, whose names emptied decks, whose captains understood that fear itself was a weapon sharper than any cutlass. The Happy Delivery, torturing crews in the Bay of Honduras, the Rising Sun, black-hulled and red-sailed, whose captain was so feared his own men marooned him. The Chasseur, one American schooner that blockaded the entire British Empire. The Terrible, whose muster book of death and devil and ghost read like a curse and ended like one. The Mocha, the East India Company's own frigate turned manhunter of the company's own convoys. The Speaker, a French war frigate turned pirate flagship whose broadside no merchant would face. The Fiery Dragon, whose Arab prize off Bombay made every one of her crew wealthier than a colonial governor. The Amity, 70 tons, that opened the greatest gold rush in the history of piracy. The Golden Fleece, that fought the Royal Navy to a standstill with 2 shore batteries and a beached hull. And the Bachelor's Delight, a stolen Danish slaver that carried 3 future best-selling authors around the world and forced Spain to move her treasure by mule. Did we get the ranking right? Should the Bachelor's Delight be number 1? Or does the Golden Fleece deserve the top spot for standing off the Royal Navy? Should the Amity be higher for what she started? Drop a comment right now and tell us which of these ships you would have most feared on the horizon in 1720. And tell us where in the world you are watching from. Our community stretches from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean to every port in between. And every one of you is part of what keeps these forgotten stories alive. If this ranking changed how you see the age of sail, hit the like button, because every like tells the algorithm to push this to more people who want history the textbooks never covered. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we have more of these coming, more pirates, more ships, more countdowns, more of the stories that never made it into the movies. Thank you for watching. These ships and the men who sailed them deserve to be remembered for what they actually did, not what Hollywood turned them into. Sails up, powder dry. We will see you in the next one.